Okay, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wharton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And Mark is also happy to answer questions that you can email him later. Mark Schenker has been at Yale College since 1990 and is currently a Senior Associate Dean of the College and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department at Yale, he received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. For over 30 years, Dean Schenker has lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries and retirement communities, museums, and cultural centers. We're certainly very happy when he comes back to give us 4 or 5 session programs, and we're very happy to be starting this one off. It's got 5 sessions, not 4. When we were going over the authors, we just couldn't remove one of them. So we're doing 5. There's a break on March 10 where there'll be no session because of the schedule. So we've got this week and next week, then a break, and then 3 more weeks, all Thursday evenings at 7 o'clock. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark, and we'll get started with the program. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank Michael more broadly for his partnership, not just with this series, but for what is now years of series, despite COVID. Truth be told, I wanted to do 97 novels, but Michael whittled me down to 5. So he mentioned to me earlier today that breaking at midpoint to invite some commentary or questions went well. And so I'm going to try to do that at least today and maybe at every session. We are doing the modern American novel and picking 5 novels from House of Mirth in 1905, which technically is not a modern American novel. For our purposes, modernism is a period between the 2 world wars, and so it's early. But I picked it to show you as a kind of transition novel between the kind of 19th century novels that we talked about in our Victorian novel session, and to say that it has some of that old-fashioned sense of a novel. You may remember when we talked about the Victorian novel, they were marriage novels. They were, many of them, novels about a woman, sometimes a man, but more often a woman, and a choice of life, choice of husbands, choice of future. Certainly, The House of Mirth is a marriage or non-marriage novel, and it is decidedly about Lily Bart's choice of life. So I'm doing it to show how that novel of Wharton in the first decade of the 20th century is a kind of bridge between the novels of Henry James, her mentor and friend and colleague, who as an American came abroad and wrote about England and European society while living in England and eventually becoming an English citizen when the First World War broke out. And when Edith Wharton asked his advice about whether she should do the same, he told her, no, you should do what you know best, which is working in America on moneyed old New York society. The ungenerous view of that is that he didn't want the competition, but I'm more generous than that. I think he really meant that he was doing one kind of thing and she would do another. He came from a prosperous family, but she came from a really wealthy family. Her maiden name was Jones, and it is purported that her family was the Jones with whom people tried to keep up, if you see what I mean. So we'll talk more about this novel as a cusp novel, but I want to say that a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the modern American novel shares what I've said about modernism when we spoke about the modern British novel. So I'm going to review that very briefly for those of you who heard me but forgot, for those of you who are new, and then add a few things that are particularly American. So I mentioned in the season that we were doing modern British novel that modernism as a theme and method is interested in when society and culture has gotten so advanced, it's lost sight of the fundamental sources of human value. And so intellectuals and artists and others try to revive the contemporary society with the primitive. Primitive is not a pejorative term, the pre-technological, Picasso exploring African art and other cultures, Stravinsky's use of pagan themes in The Rite of Spring, that's 1913, Eliot's critical view of the contemporary world as a wasteland by looking at Hindu and Buddhist texts and cross-cultural myths in 1922, The Wasteland. Joyce appropriating Homer in his novel Ulysses, also published in 1922. So we will see aspects of that not receding, but in moving back as a positive motion to the primitive to counteract the vapidity of the modern age. Modernism also is a response to the idea of loss, the loss of a common world. Virginia Woolf, one of the modernists we did last time, wrote of Jane Austen that to believe that your impressions hold good for others is to be released from the cramp and confinement of personality. That is, if you could, like Jane Austen, think your view was typical of your class, you weren't confined by your own personality. And of course, Virginia Woolf sees that confinement as a sometimes negative thing. And in The Wasteland, that 1922 poem that was so influential by Eliot, he has a passage in which a character says, I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his own prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. That is, what we have in common is our separate isolation. And that notion of isolation and loneliness, alienation are very common themes in the first decades of the 20th century on either side of the Atlantic. John Milton, William Shakespeare, Samuel Johnson, they might have known loneliness, they might have known unhappiness, certainly some of them suffered from depression. They would not have thought of themselves as alienated. Alienation is a modern phenomenon. The world has gotten too big, too fractured, too remote, too valueless to feel that you belong. You cannot be alienated from a society that's strange to you. If I were to relocate to Bolivia, I would not feel alienated there. I'd feel foreign or out of place or strange. You are alienated, made to feel strange in a community or tribe that you should belong to. And one of the tragedies of this novel tonight, The House of Mirth, is that Lily Bart belongs to that tribe, but feels alienated for it. And that's the source of her great tragedy. Like Tess, which was the last novel we did in the Victorian series, 1891, exactly 14 years before tonight's novel, Tess also felt at odds with the society she was in. And as it happens, The House of Mirth falls just halfway between Tess, that last Victorian novel, and Winesburg, Ohio, which is 14 years after tonight's novel, the next novel we'll be doing. So all those things that I've said about modernism, the primitive, alienation, we can add to that what I said last time about collage and the idea of disjunction, that the literature is very interested in disjunction in narration, not just in your life, but in narration. This novel does not have that disjunction. It's told in regular narrative style, but we will be looking at some works with Winesburg, Ohio, a collection of short stories that functions as a novel, sometimes called a short story cycle. But we will see most clearly in our time where there's alternation between reportage and actual short stories, some of them having nothing to do with each other. We'll see that kind of collage or disjunction. And we'll see it also in The Sound and the Fury, where the separate parts, like the separate parts of Ulysses, are written in different styles. So we have that to see also. But one of the things that's going to make these novels American is that America had one thing in its development that Europe and England did not, and that is a frontier. If you read the Puritan literature, early colonial literature, even the literature into the 19th century of Thoreau, Walden, the Scarlet Letter, and the idea of being in a society where the woods are fearful, the idea of a frontier that could invite you to your manifest destiny, but also marks the end of civilization. This is where it's okay to be, and over there is dangerous. That's an idea that is part of the American consciousness from when America was founded that you don't see repeated in other countries. I don't mean countries didn't have civilized places and scary places, but they didn't have the sense that they were moving, they thought, by destiny across the continent to the West. And one of the things that means is that there is a split in the American ideal early on between individual rights and majority rule, but more fundamentally between the Puritan settlers who believed that life was suffused with sin and limitation, that the self was a negative thing because the self was greedy and appetitive and vain, and that what you wanted to develop was your soul, and the soul was not the same as the self. And you see that in something like the Scarlet Letter, the tension between the independence of Hester Prynne and the mores of the town. By contrast, if instead of the model of the Puritan, we think of an early American type as the pioneer, purposely picking two words that I'm stressing the capital P, the Puritan does not believe, the pioneer does not believe in sin and limitation. They believe in courage and resourcefulness, Emerson's self-reliance, aspiration. They see the self as a positive thing. And as opposed to the Scarlet Letter, you have the image of aspiration in any number of novels, most conveniently in Moby Dick, where although you can say that Ahab is mad, he has a pioneer sense of breaking new territory. That idea of the expansiveness of the pioneer's view of America and the constrictiveness of the Puritan's view of America is shot through all of literature in America, even to today, but especially in the novels we're going to be looking at. You can think of the typical constrictive 19th century poet as being Emily Dickinson. You only have to look at her poems from a distance to see how tight and short and concentrated, economical they are, how tentative she is, sometimes fearful of a world of expansiveness, and contrast her to the pioneer spirit of Walt Whitman, whose, again, verse on the page is scattering all over. You could see it from a distance like an eye chart, and you could say that's Emily Dickinson and that's Walt Whitman. So that tension between the expansive and the constrictive is not uniquely American, but it's distinctly American. And we're going to keep an eye on that through the series. So turning now to House of Mirth, I want to acknowledge my friend Penny Green, who I believe is in the audience tonight, who wrote to me very kindly today to say she was looking forward to being here this evening. I hope she is. Hi, Penny, if you are. And she reminded me that years ago when we did this book in one of my private groups, she asked the question, why does Lily have to die? Like me, I think she has a lot of affection for Lily. I have a great affection for this novel. I have a great affection for Lily Bart. And she reminded me, or she told me, I have to believe her, I don't remember, that I answered, that's because the author wanted her to die. And whether she was happy with that maybe smart ass answer, that's a literary term, smart ass or not, I don't know. But we're still friends, and so she mustn't have been too upset. So I wrote to her today, and I'm going to read my answer because it's a better answer than the one that I gave her then, although it's related. Wharton sees Lily Bart and her situation as deeply tragic. This is a very tragic novel like Tess. I'll touch on that, of course, this evening. The author knew that this was the fate of countless women in her day who did not enjoy the social and economic benefits that Wharton herself did. The epigraph of the novel, taken from the book of Ecclesiastes, proposes that wisdom is allied with loss and grief. The way of the world is sorrow, while foolishness sees only the mirth of life. And mirth is not joy, it's the mindless pleasures of non-introspective, conspicuous existence in Wharton's view. It's amusement rather than true satisfaction. Lily is a thoughtful, moral person living among a tribe of people who seek amusement rather than true joy. She's unable to leave or transcend that group because she likes being beautiful, she likes being happy, she likes having money, she loses too much of it. She likes the realm that she's moving in, even though she's on the borders of it, even though there are aspects of it that she despises. So she joins that society in her own contradictory way and finds herself destroyed by it. That is the tragedy of Lily Bart. So Wharton played with a number of different titles for the novel, one of which was The Year of the Rose. Her nickname in her family, Edith's nickname was Rose. She also thought of calling it A Moment's Ornament, with the notion that women are meant to be transient ornaments. Well, one of the things about Lily, we're told, is her conspicuousness. When she sits on the train, she makes sure she sits as to give maximum effect. She does a tableau vivant where she dresses up and acts as an incarnation of a painting. And there's a lot to be said for her being more aesthetic, artistic, and artificial than genuine. And she likes the approbation she gets. She knows she has what some social psychologists call good-looking people syndrome. But at the heart of her tragedy is conflict, which is always the case. And Mrs. Fisher in the novel says in the first chapter of book 2, sometimes I think it's just flightiness, that is how Lily comports herself. And sometimes I think it's because at heart, she despises the things she's trying for. And it's the difficulty of deciding that makes her such an interesting study. Well, that's sheer genius, because that's Lily Bart. Despise is not a mild word. Lily despises the world that she's trying for, but she has no other option in her view. You remember that we're told about Dorothea Brooke that if she lived at another time, she might have found it in order. But given her limitations, the best she could do, in her view, was give her goodness, give herself as a wife to a worthy man. And she makes a bad choice because she doesn't see well physically or morally. Lily's conflict, Lily's tragedy is she despises the world that she can't leave, and she doesn't have enough money, she doesn't have enough standing to make the kind of choice she wants. And so that conflict gets realized in the conflict between a choice of life. We know, she knows that Selden loves her. He won't quite say it. There's a terrific scene on that Sunday early in the novel where they walk to a hilltop and basically act like adolescents. Would you, yeah, I'd marry you, but you don't want me to marry you. Well, do you want me to marry you? You know, I'll see you in homeroom. They're acting like children, but they want each other. But what they won't compromise is he doesn't want to lose his freedom by having to make the kind of money that would give Lily the life she wants. And she does not want to lose the life she has by marrying someone whose things are shabby. He is a good person. He believes in the Republic of the Spirit, but his furniture is shabby. That word is the word used. We're told that Lily's upbringing was done among things after her father died that were dingy. Dingy is a very resonant word. If you're poor, if you're truly poor, you don't think of your things as dingy. You're happy to have clothes, you're happy to have furniture. But if you aspire to more and you're living on the edge of the people who have more, you think of your things as dingy, a word that's associated, derived from the word dung. And Lily wants better things. But the other choice of her life early on in the first chapter, she leaves Selden and she runs into Rosedale, who is a moneyed person, but she finds him repellent. Unfortunately, part of his being repellent is that he's Jewish, and there's no way around Edith Wharton's anti-Semitism in that regard, which I'm not whitewashing. That's itself is repellent. But her choice is between a moneyless man who actually loves her and someone who is financially sound, but she finds again, she despises. And that's the problem that sets up the tragedy. It's the this and the thatness that makes tragedy. If she were more like that or more like this, she'd be fine. Just like if Dorothea didn't care about dedicating herself to someone and wanted to marry someone who was good, she would have made Sir James a happy man. But no, she wants to do good, and she is not smart enough to know how to do that right, and she's caught up in that conflict. So I'll say more about the novel in terms of its tragedy. It's what it says about male and female relations in this period of time. Again, 1905, the first decade of the century, still deeply ensconced in women's roles being largely domestic, the angel of the house. When she thinks of a choice of life, she wouldn't have many choices, even if she were willing to give up the life she has. In 1870, around the time, exact year, in fact, that Dickens died, 6.4% of the non-agricultural jobs held by women were women in the professions, 6 out of 100. By 1910, around the year this novel was published, that was 10% of the non-agricultural working women were professionals. But by 1920, after the war, it rose to 13.3%. That is more than double what it was at the end of the 19th century. Well, she's caught before that, and this is a novel very much about a woman's plight, as is Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina and Hedda Gabler and Kate Chopin's The Awakening. A lot of late 19th, early 20th century novels. Russia, France, England, America are looking at that plight, and this continues in that vein. So I'll pause now, since we're near the bottom of the hour, to take questions or comments briefly, and then we'll take a look at what the novel does with Lily's plight.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so folks, so you can use the Q&A box if you want to give a question or make a comment. I see someone with a hand up, but we're not using the hand raise in the speaking. So just use the Q&A box and give us a question or a comment that way. The first one that we have here is more of, I guess, of a reading suggestion rather than so much focused on this novel per se. The person is asking, what contemporary novels would you say reflect the Puritan versus pioneer traditions?
I'm going to skip that question as being off topic. I've got 5 novels to talk about eventually. I have half an hour to finish with House of Mirth. That's a question. Send it to me by email. I'll give you my best shot. But let's try to keep on either this novel or the modern American novels. I'm defining it in these 25 years that we're looking at.
Fair enough. And as Mark said, folks, and having now done this with him many, many times, he really means it. Go ahead and send him an email. If you don't have his email address, just let me know. I'll pass it along to you. And I've actually found some of his answers to be quite quite astonishing and interesting in themselves.
I'm going to ignore that Michael just said he's actually found them. I'm going to ignore that actually. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Why don't we keep going? Because
Okay.
that was the comment
Okay.
that we
And
had.
I meant no disrespect by declining that answer. I'll give you an answer happily. I don't have anything in my head now, but I'll come up with something.
Oh, hey, Mark,
So
someone actually, so excuse
yeah,
me a second. Someone
yeah.
just put one in there when I was closing it. What do you think Wharton's attitude is towards Lily's character? At times it feels ironic, at other times very sympathetic.
Yeah, so that whoever said that, I think that's a brilliant coupling of adjectives. I think it is sympathetic and ironic, depending on how you feel about it, sympathetically ironic or ironically sympathetic. There's no doubt that the narrator, which is not identical to Wharton, but closely allied, seeps into Lily from time to time and vice versa. And I think she has a lot of sympathy, empathy for Lily as someone who is a victim of how she was bred to be beautiful, to be conspicuous, a word that's associated with her more than once. The whole economic theory of conspicuous consumption, which is an aspect of these upper classes, comes into play at just these decades. I think she's very aware, Edith Wharton, that she herself might have been a Lily Bart if it wasn't for the fact that she not only had money, but she had talent. She had something she could do. And so I think there's a lot of sympathy. And I also think that it'll become clear, whether you agree with me or not, and of course you don't have to, that I believe that Selden is pitched as an anti-hero in order to make us feel much more sympathetic to Lily Bart. If we accept that they really do love each other and that they're sparring in this sort of adolescent way, because neither one of them has the courage, they each call the other, they each say that the two of them are cowards, and I think they're right. So I'll begin by looking at the very first sentence of the novel. Selden paused in surprise. In the afternoon rush of the Grand Central Station, his eyes had been refreshed by the sight of Lily Bart. So the first word of the novel is Selden in two sentences that begin with Selden and end with Miss Lily Bart. But what is the connection that's being made there? It's a connection of spectator and spectacle. It's a very strange locution, and I will say this novel on every page rewards this kind of attention to detail, which I can't possibly do justice to in the remaining 30 minutes. I might say to Michael, who I was very happy to see when we got together again 40 minutes ago, I might say to him, you're a sight for sore eyes, and we know what that cliche means. I'm happy to see him. But to say his eyes had been refreshed by the sight of Lily Bart makes it seem as it's only visual and sensory. It has nothing to do with his heart, his imagination, his personality. How did you feel seeing Lily, Lawrence? Oh, my eyes were refreshed by the sight of her. What? Very, very odd. In Dubliners, Joyce has a story called Eveline, in which we're told that the odor of a musky fabric filled her nose. Not that she smelled it, that it filled her nose, because she's made to be completely passive. She doesn't smell, odors go into her nose. I hope you will see that construction, his eyes had been refreshed by the sight of Lily Bart. And we're told that he thinks of her as a wonderful spectacle. He says in one of the chapters, in book 1, chapter 4, you're such a wonderful spectacle. I always like to see what you are doing. And there's a way that in spectating her, he's enacting what is called in cinema, the male gaze. And I want to assure you, this is not digression. This idea of the odd relationship between a spectating Selden who will watch but not embrace, who will admire aesthetically but not love emotionally is what keeps Lily at a distance. And it's part of what adds to her destruction, because the novel makes clear that they actually have a lot in common as being outsiders on the dingy, shabby edge of things. But the difference is he can survive as a shabby bachelor in a hotel loaded with bachelor flats, and she cannot. So it opens with this notion of this spectating, and the male gaze is a theory in cinema largely accepted by film critics, that because the camera is so often being pointed by men, that in early cinema, the screenwriters and nearly everybody else who worked on movies were men. Continuity was done by script girls. That's the person who, when the scene ended, had to remember that Gary Cooper was holding his gun in his left hand before the camera stopped, and then remind him to have it in his left hand when it began. It was a kind of secretarial job. It was thought that women could do that. But early Hollywood did not have many roles for women, and the camera got associated with male power, male dominance, male gaze, and male sexuality. It's one of the reasons people believe that you can see female nudity in a trivial way, in a kind of passing way, including full frontal nudity. But you can't see male nudity unless it's masked as, oh, a fleeting shot of somebody's bare behind in a baseball player's locker room. Because to have the camera look long at a male body naked would suggest homosexuality if the camera is associated with men. That may sound wacky to you. I'll let that go. But this novel is suffused with Selden being a spectator rather than a player of life. And what he's spectating is a woman who wants him to step into the game. She says he has everything to play the part. He could be in this world that I could be in too, but he refuses to do it. If that doesn't strike you as convincing, and I well understand that it may not, it says that one of the things about Selden is that he sees poetry in the beauty of Lily Bart, but he loses that sense when he's not with her. That's a remarkable statement. In Madame Bovary, we're told that Emma Bovary is so in love with the idea of her illicit lover that when he actually shows up, she's annoyed because he interrupts her licentious daydreams about him. And she'd rather think about him than have him there, because she's interested in pleasure and she can manage her own pleasure better than he can. It's a remarkably scandalous statement for a novel in France in the 19th century. What this novel says is that Selden needs the presence of Lily to remember how her beauty is poetic. He can't remember in her absence. And I thought I would share with you a favorite poem of mine. I hope you won't see this as irrelevant, by a writer, an American writer named Witter, W-I-T-T-E-R, Byner, B-Y-N-E-R, whose dates are 1881 to 1968. It's called Lightning. It's not long. There is a solitude in seeing you, followed by your company when you are gone. You are like heaven's veins of lightning. I cannot see till afterward how beautiful you are. There is a blindness in seeing you, followed by the sight of you when you are gone. Valentine's Day is past, but make a note, that poem's online. One of the most romantic poems I've ever read, and true to the experience when you're in love. He's the opposite example of that. He only experiences her company in her company, and he doesn't have the non-visual appreciation of all that she is that even other people in the novel do, and I think we do as readers. And where this becomes grotesque is at the end of the novel. Now, a lot happens in the novel. A lot of it is bad judgment on Lily's part. about, for example, lying that she was at her dressmaker's to Rosedale, not knowing that he owns the building and knows for a fact that there are no dressmakers in the building. And so in trying to avoid a scandal by saying as a single woman, she was visiting an old friend, a single man, in his apartment, which in 1906 would have been on the borderline of scandalous. Instead of just not caring about that, she worries about the reputation. She wants to be part of the tribe she despises, and so she lies. And she does other things that compromise her good judgment and her virtue, even though in the end, she aspires and often does the right thing. So we're told that when she's failing, and it's an open question about whether she intentionally kills herself or she does what many people do as a kind of unintentional suicide, including tragically young people who drink too much and drive too fast, not because they really want to die, but become so reckless it's kind of borderline suicide, or whether it's truly an accident. But in any event, as she's thinking about her life, she has an idea that there's a word that she wants to tell Selden. She wants to communicate a word to him, and she hopes that she'll remember it when she wakes up. The novel never tells us what that word is. Edith Wharton has never said what that word is, but it has come to her mind when she spent time with women who have children. I'll read this. This is from book 2, chapter 14. She stirred once and turned on her side, and as she did so, she suddenly understood why she did not feel herself alone. It was odd, but Nettie Struthers' child was lying on her arm. She felt the pressure of its little head against her shoulder. She did not know how it had come there, but she felt no great surprise at the fact, only a gentle, penetrating thrill of warmth and pleasure. Remember, she's at a very low point in her life. She settled herself into an easier position, hollowing her arm to pillow the round, downy head and holding her breath lest a sound should disturb the sleeping child. That's a remarkable passage in a novel where you barely know that children exist. In many people's view, the reason to get married is to make families. I'm talking broadly. People do what they want, of course. But in this novel, in so many marriage novels, you forget that there are children. The children aren't given attention, or in something like Madame Bovary or Anna Karenina, part of the woman's adultery is the abandonment of the child. So when she thinks about cradling this child and not disturbing its sleep, it says, immediately next paragraph, as she lay there, she said to herself that there was something she must tell Selden, some word she had found that should make life clear between them. She tried to repeat the word, which lingered vague and luminous on the far edge of thought. She was afraid of not remembering it when she woke. If she could only remember it and say it to him, she felt that everything would be well. And she sank into her sleep, that's eventual death. That's a very powerful idea. If she could remember the word and say it to him, she felt that everything would be well. So we're all allowed to imagine what that word would be. I think the word is some amalgam of love in the broadest sense of feeling someone else penetrate into your being with warmth and joy. And it's related to motherhood. It could be related to fatherhood, but she's a woman sleeping in bed with another woman's baby in her arm. So if you could mush together the word love and life, love that's not sexual love, but on a continuum with it. In Annie Hall, the Woody Allen character, which is to say Woody Allen, says that the word love is insufficient to explain how he feels about the Diane Keaton character. He says it would have to be a word like lief, lief, and he makes some kind of Scandinavian approximation of what I'm talking about, an amalgam of love and life. I think that's the word she has in mind. But what happens? She doesn't get to tell Selden that. He comes too late. He looks around the flat. He understands something about what happens, understands that she tried to make things right, sees the check to Trenner and all of that. And then it says, and I'm going to read the last couple of paragraphs of the novel, a remarkable thing, and I hope you'll follow along with me, even if you don't have the book in front of you. I'll read slowly. He saw, she's dead. She's lying dead on the bed or couch. He saw that all the conditions of life had conspired to keep them apart, since his very detachment from the external influences which swayed her had increased his spiritual fastidiousness. He's trying to stay free of the tawdry life that he and she despised, and made it more difficult for him to live and love uncritically. But at least he had loved her, had been willing to stake his future on his faith in her, but not enough to marry her. And if the moment had been fated to pass from them before he could seize it, because she's dead, he saw now that for both it had been saved whole out of the ruin of their lives. That is, she had proved herself to be a moral person. I'm going to read that last sentence again. If the moment had been fated, has it been fated? Is he not responsible in part for what happened to her? If it had been fated to pass from them before they could seize it, he saw now that for both it had been saved out of the ruin of their lives. She's dead. The ruin of their lives. He is sitting there thinking about what he can learn from this situation. It was this moment of love, this fleeting victory over themselves, which had kept them from atrophy and extinction. She's dead. I'm adding that she's dead, you understand, which in her had reached out to him in every struggle against the influence of surroundings, and in him had kept alive the faith that now drew him penitent and reconciled to her side. That is, he believed that she was essentially a good person, not worth marrying, but a good person. He knelt by the bed and bent over her, draining their last moment to its lees. And in the silence there passed between them the word which made all clear. There is no way to read that ending except as darkly ironic. He knelt by the bed and bent over her, watching this moment, draining this last moment to his leaf. This is for him a Kodak moment. The novel began by him looking at Lily, alive, but for his own purposes. And now he's looking at her dead for his own purposes. And what does it mean that he's drinking this last moment to its lees, to the very dregs? He wants to get every last drop of the lesson of what is to be taken from this. Even though she's dead, even though he did not have enough faith to join her in a relationship, she was responsible too for her cowardliness. There's no doubt about that. But Lily would not be capable of this kind of hypocrisy or self-ignorance. And draining the last moment to its lees suggests that he's trying to suck, I'm using that verb intentionally, the last bit of life out of it. There is a model in the decade before this novel was published for a man who admires a beautiful woman as a work of art, as something distant, that he won't have sex with, but will be willing to suck the life out of her. And it's a novel by Bram Stoker called Dracula. I really do mean that I think Edith Wharton, who was a brilliant writer, means to figure him as someone who's gone from spectating Lily from a distance for his own purposes, refreshing his eyes, not his soul, not his spirit. She's good to look at. Why not? There are such people. Some of you in the audience tonight are those people. But at the end, it turns very dark, and he becomes what Edith Wharton said to colleagues was, a negative hero. The male spectating gaze, by enticing her and denying her, by keeping up this sort of cat and mouse game, this adolescent, well, I suppose I would marry you, but of course you wouldn't marry me. I wouldn't. And again, if you want to read that chapter when they don't go to Sunday Mass together and walk up the hillside before coming down again, descending into reality, it's a very revealing chapter. Lily does not get to say the word love or life to him. He thinks there's a word that has passed between them, but the word that passes between them that he doesn't hear, that Edith Wharton intends, is death. That is, he has denied her, denied himself something like life. And his self-articulated Republic of the Spirit is a cheat because he could have given her more. And I think it's damning of him. And she looks much better by comparison for at least trying to do the right thing. And I think many people who read this book think of that ending as a romantic, sentimental, dreamy moment. And I don't think anything could be farther from it. You cannot read that he's saving this moment from the ruin and extinction of their lives and remember that she's dead on the bed, dying partly because she's been abandoned in the broadest sense. He didn't kill her, but he certainly not, what happened to her was certainly not just fate. So I'll say in conclusion, to leave time for questions, but one of the remarkable things that happens at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century on both sides of the Atlantic, and in more than just England and America, is the notion that tragedy is no longer a matter of the fates as it was in the Greek and Roman times, that society and hypocrisy and class values and greed and selfishness, these become the powers of fate that doom someone like Tess, who was raped, to be seen as a fallen woman by the man who spent months being promiscuous in Paris. Did I say Paris? Yes, Paris. And he has no sense of the hypocrisy, the double standard, when she can't believe that she's being rejected because she was honest enough, moral enough, we're told in the subtitle of the book that she's a moral girl, to ignore her mother's advice and tell him the truth that she's not a virgin because she was raped by a cousin, sent there to try to find her family's fortune. He says to her, I can't accept you. You were one woman last night. You're another woman today. That idea of the double standard that we see in Ibsen's plays, in Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, Hedda Gabler, in Scarlet Letter. Only the woman wears the letter because only the woman's pregnancy shows. The guy who helped her get pregnant is actually the Reverend Dimsdale, his name suggesting that he's hiding, equally guilty of the violation, but more guilty of the hypocrisy. These novels at the turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th century, are very, very much interested in what happens to a woman's fate. In Daniel Deronda, when Gwendolyn Hart, that's last of Henry James's novels, not the last, a late Henry James, 1870s, I think. Daniel Deronda, Gwendolyn Harleth has a choice of life. And the man she's going to marry, whose name is Grandcourt, very prestigious, very wealthy. It turns out he has a mistress and he has sired children on her, and he has refused to support her or the children. And this woman comes upon Gwendolyn Harleth by design and says to her, I'm begging you to do the right thing and make your husband-to-be marry me, or at least provide me with some kind of support. And Gwendolyn Harleth is horrified to find out, like Jane Eyre finds out, that the man who loves her has a past that's sordid. And the character, whose name is Lydia Glazer, says to Gwendolyn, I am a woman's life. look at me, this is what happens to women. And Gwendolyn does the decidedly wrong thing. Lily in this novel, Tess in Hardy's novel, again, not that far before this, 14 years, try to do the right thing and they're ground to death by it. It's very poignant. Tess written by a man, House of Mirth written by a woman. This is a late kind of Victorian byproduct of the marriage novel, the choice of life novel. This is a woman's life novel. We won't see this repeated in the novels we're turning to. When we move 14 years down the timeline to Winesburg, Ohio, 1919, with the influence of the war suffusing it, the First World War never goes away. I didn't say tonight, as I said when I introduced the modern British novel, and I should have said earlier, the First World War, once it's happened, suffuses the novels we're doing for the remainder of the series, as it does The Wasteland, as it does The Great Gatsby, which doesn't seem to be a novel about the war, but is, and so on. So I hope that's a clear explanation of why I asked Michael if we could add this fifth novel as a kind of prologue to turning to the novels that are actually modern in the literary sense of being between the wars. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Mark. Got a few questions. Excuse me. So Wharton shows Rosedale as a decent character who is willing to help Lily, more decent than most of the other characters. Do you think Wharton painted him sympathetically?
I want to say that the reason I hesitate to answer these questions is that every reader should decide how characters strike you in terms of sympathy. Sympathetic responses to characters is one of the most personal reactions you can have. And when I teach my undergraduates, I don't tell them who they should be sympathetic to. I'm interested in their telling me who they will be sympathetic to. And I'm only skirting that question because it's a question that should be skirted. The questioner should ask that question of themselves, or if you know people in your circle who read the book, that's a good thing to talk about. But let's be frank, we could have disagreements about how sympathetic we are to Michael or how sympathetic you are to me. We could talk about people we know well in our family or neighborhood and have radically different feelings about whether we're sympathetic to their circumstances based on who we are, what our biases are, what we think we know about them, what we actually know about them. That's not a question that I think is ultimately for a discussion leader to answer, but it's a good question to raise in groups. And I want to make it clear, I do think that one of the best things people can talk about when they talk about realistic fiction is who struck you as credible and why. If I acknowledge to myself that I have a great deal of affection and admiration for Lily Bart, it's a testament to how convincing Wharton's literary realism is, because I read lots of novels where I get what the character's about, but I don't have any personal feelings about them because in my reading, the novelist hasn't hit those chords with me.
Got it. Okay, how about this one? Do you see connections among Ethan Frome, Selden, and Newland Archer's refusals to act or speak up?
Yeah, that's a very interesting mix. So Ethan Frome in the novel, the same name, Newland Archer by Wharton. Yes, I do think that there is one of the tragedies is this failure to act, this receding, not in the sense of the primitive returning to an original source, but more like the constrictive nature of what is said about Puritanism. I think Dickinson and Whitman are equally great poets, but there is a tentativeness, there is a shyness, there is a vulnerability in the narrator of so many of Emily Dickinson's poems, this idea that the world can be a terribly frightening and invasive kind of place, and just the opposite in Whitman. And what I'm saying this evening is Both of those are distinct American strains. And some of what this question is asking about those characters, Ethan Frome in particular, someone who's associated with New England isolation and pain and inarticulateness, very much, I think that's an insightful connection among the three.
Got it. Okay, isn't the idea of the Republic of the Spirit championed by Edith Wharton in the House of Mirth?
I'm sorry, is that a question? Isn't it what?
Isn't the idea of the Republic of the Spirit championed by Edith Wharton in the House of Mirth?
Well, yes and no. So I think if I were having tea with Edith Wharton, she would say, yes, Republic of the Spirit is an excellent idea. I liked it when I read about it in Emerson. But when a guy uses it as an explanation for why he lives a life of isolation and treats a friend and possible lover like blank, no, she's not championing how he uses it. A lover friend might be quite moved by kneeling down next to the bed of the dead lover friend and being emotionally moved by the experience, being heartbroken. Such a scene could extol the goodness of both characters, but that's not how the scene is enacted. The scene is enacted as his drinking it to the lees, taking a cup, turning it upside down, and getting every last bit of this romantic image of her dead. So the Republic of Spirit is something that Edith Wharton believes in, but in the context of the novel, the way it's expressed by Selden, it's trivialized. I'll make this my last comment. One of the things that has happened to Shakespeare for 100 years or more is that he's such a good poet that people like phrases of his, and you get wall calendars and desk calendars, a Shakespeare quote a day. And what people do is they glom on to the quotations. This is not a snobbish comment, and they completely remove them from the dramatic context. In the dramatic context, it's not just Shakespeare who's talking, it's a character. So when you have you turn over and tomorrow's the 27th of February, whatever it is, and you see, oh, the quotation, neither a borrower nor a lender be, you think, oh, that's pretty catchy. But Polonius said that, one of the great asses of Shakespearean literature. Shakespeare doesn't believe that you should neither borrow nor lend. Shakespeare believes in the generosity of spirit. Shakespeare would never endorse that statement, but it gets onto proverb books. Another one is when at the beginning of Twelfth Night, the Count Orsino says, if music be the fruit of love, play on. Well, Orsino is in love with love. He's in love with a woman he can't bother to go down the road to visit, so he sends an emissary. Shakespeare would not have believed that music is the food of love. The food of love is other people. And that's what he has to get out and find instead of using an emissary, a woman disguised as a man that both he and the woman he loves fall in love with. If this doesn't resonate with you, tomorrow, tonight, now, read Twelfth Night. But that line, which is catchy, is not something that Shakespeare is promoting. It's something that's true of a character with his own limitations. And I think that's what I would say about Republic of the Spirit. Let me just say that Winesburg, Ohio embraces the primitivism I've been talking about by being written in a very plain, flat style. You might find it off-putting. All I can suggest is try to give yourself over to it. You know that when you see a movie that has subtitles in a foreign language, and the first time you do it, it might seem like you're working too hard for a recreational experience. And then before long, maybe even the first time you do it in the same movie, you forget that you're doing it. You may even misremember the movie later on as being in English, even though it was in Dutch or whatever language it was. So Winesburg, Ohio has that primitive sort of flatness, a kind of mythic quality to it, plainness to it. It's also a collection of stories, as is in our time, so that notion of collage. And you'll see that while House of Mirth has affinities to some of the great Victorian novels, there's nothing in Weinberg, Ohio that would put you in mind of the Victorian novels that we talked about a season ago. So once again, thank you all. I see that there's some 90 of you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying home tonight. I guess the best thing I could put it, for attending to this. I'm delighted again that Wilton Library and Michael have invited me back for this series. I look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be in March, closer to spring, and talk about Weinberg, Ohio. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael.
Great, thanks, Mark. And there was one question at the end. You just send me an email, and I'll send you on to Mark on that one. And we'll see everybody next week. Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.